The January wind bit sharply at Anzio that winter afternoon. Hauptmann Werner Hoffmann pressed himself against the cold concrete of his command bunker, his pencil moving unsteadily across the paper in his trembling hand. What he had just witnessed through the observation periscope defied everything he understood about fortification. The Americans possessed artillery of a scale and power that seemed almost supernatural. Bunker Luisa simply ceased to exist. 4 feet of reinforced concrete, solid, engineered, tested, vanished in an instant. Where the strongpoint had stood for 8 months, protecting the German defensive line, now stretched an enormous crater, half hidden beneath rolling smoke and dust. The bunker had been built to withstand direct hits from 290mm shells, according to the Wehrmacht's own engineering calculations. A single American shell from a weapon firing beyond the horizon had erased it completely. 32 men from the 3rd Panzer Grenadier Division disappeared with it. Tons of concrete and steel simply gone. The weapon responsible was the M-120mm howitzer, making its first appearance in actual combat with the 697th Field Artillery Battalion. In the months to come, Hoffmann and thousands of other German defenders would realize that every principle they had learned about defensive warfare had become obsolete in a single afternoon. The Americans had fielded something unprecedented, a gun that could reduce the most powerful bunker into a tomb with almost mathematical certainty. The M-120mm howitzer hadn't emerged from tradition or improvisation. It came from a 1940 American ordnance study that had reached one unmistakable conclusion. Existing American artillery could not defeat the modern European fortifications that Germany was building across occupied Europe. The heaviest gun then in service, the 155mm long Tom, could inflict damage on reinforced concrete bunkers, but it couldn't reliably destroy them. German defensive doctrine was shifting toward increasingly sophisticated fortified positions, and the Americans knew they needed something far more powerful. The specifications demanded something that sounded nearly impossible to achieve. A mobile weapon capable of firing a 360-pound shell more than 14 miles, with enough precision to strike individual bunkers and powerful enough to punch through 6 feet of reinforced concrete. The entire system had to travel on standard military vehicles. Nothing like the massive railway guns from the First World War. This had to be mobile, adaptable, able to support rapid warfare. What finally emerged from Watervliet Arsenal in upstate New York was nothing short of an engineering masterpiece. In firing position, the weapon weighed 64,700 pounds. The crew needed 14 men to operate it properly, and under ideal conditions, it could deliver 1 round every 3 minutes. The barrel alone weighed 23,000 pounds and stretched 35 feet long. Moving it required a specially designed 6-wheeled wagon. Preparing it for battle consumed 8 hours of careful work, digging a recoil pit, assembling the piece using a specialized M2 crane that traveled with each gun. Production started in November 1942 with 6 experimental models, but the Army was convinced it had found the answer. By 1944, Watervliet Arsenal had streamlined production to 13 guns monthly. Before manufacturing stopped in August 1945, the Arsenal had built exactly 315 of these weapons. Each one cost $380,000, enough money to buy 12 Sherman tanks. But their actual value on the battlefield would prove almost impossible to calculate. The 697th and 698th Field Artillery Battalions arrived at Anzio in January 1944, bringing the first M1 240mm howitzers into combat anywhere in the world. The German 14th Panzer Corps had spent months transforming the surrounding hills into a fortress system. Bunkers interlocked with one another, each one commanding specific approaches to the Allied positions. On January 30, 1944, at 2:30 in the afternoon, the 697th fired the first 240mm round under combat conditions. The target was a German observation post positioned on the Alban Hills. The shell traveled 23,000 yards, more than 13 miles, and struck with perfect accuracy. The bunker and everything inside it simply ceased. The observation equipment, the crew, the position itself, all gone in an instant. Major Herman E. Smith commanded the 697th, and he carefully documented what happened after that first day of firing. German prisoners began arriving at interrogation centers with reports of complete collapse in morale throughout their units. They spoke of shells that felt like earthquakes, ground shaking for hundreds of meters in every direction from where they struck. Many refused to occupy bunkers after seeing what the American guns could do. The destruction at Anzio was recorded with precision: 2,847 rounds fired, 67 bunkers targeted, 61 completely destroyed, an average of just under 5 rounds needed per bunker. The farthest target reached over 25,000 yards away. After Rome's liberation, American soldiers captured the war diary of the German 715th Infantry Division. The entry was stark and honest. American super-heavy artillery renders our fortified positions untenable. Losses from single shells exceed those from day-long conventional bombardments. The breakthrough at Monte Cassino in May 1944 demonstrated what these guns could accomplish against the toughest defensive positions. The Gustav Line had held firm for months. The Allies had attacked repeatedly, only to be thrown back each time. German paratroopers had converted the ancient monastery into a fortress, interlocking defensive positions that seemed impregnable. The 240th Field Artillery Battalion, equipped with 8 M1 Howitzers, became part of Operation Diadem on May 11, 1944. Positioned near Mignano, they could reach any German strongpoint along the entire Gustav Line. They concentrated on the reinforced bunkers built into the mountainside beneath the monastery. British Major General Francis Tucker commanded the 4th Indian Division. His soldiers had suffered terribly in earlier assaults against the same positions. He watched the 240mm bombardment unfold and reported his observations afterward. The American super-heavy guns accomplished what months of bombing and conventional artillery could never manage. Each shell that found its target eliminated a German strongpoint completely. The effect on the German defenders went far beyond the physical damage. They understood that nowhere was safe anymore. For 72 hours, the 240mm howitzers maintained continuous fire during the breakthrough battle. They expended 1,847 rounds. When soldiers later analyzed the results, they found that of 43 major German bunkers targeted, 39 had been completely destroyed. The 4 that survived had been abandoned by their crews following near misses that had damaged them beyond immediate use. The effectiveness of these guns didn't stem solely from the massive shell itself. American fire control systems gave them an enormous advantage. The fire direction center concept, refined through 3 years of combat experience, allowed accuracy and coordination that no one had thought possible. Forward observers with SCR 610 radios positioned miles from the actual guns could call for fire on specific targets. They transmitted their target locations to the fire direction center, where trained soldiers used graphical firing tables, slide rules, and meteorological data to calculate firing solutions. Within 4 minutes of a call for fire, shells could be landing on targets more than 14 miles away. The time-on-target technique multiplied the psychological effect dramatically. Multiple batteries firing from different positions, timed to arrive at different moments, could place all their shells on a single target within a 2-second window. A German bunker might suddenly receive 20 to 40 240mm rounds arriving almost simultaneously, over a ton of high explosive with no warning. Lieutenant Colonel Thomas B. Hedekin commanded the 245th Field Artillery Battalion, and he explained the philosophy in a 1944 report. "We don't fire barrages, we conduct surgical strikes. A forward observer identifies a specific bunker. We compute the firing solution. We drop 1 or 2 rounds directly on it. The precision terrifies the Germans far more than any volume of fire." 4 M1 240mm howitzers attached to 19th Corps joined Operation Cobra in July 1944, the great breakthrough from the Normandy beachhead. The German 350th Infantry Division had fortified every hedgerow and crossroads around Saint-Lô, creating a defensive maze that had stopped the Allies for weeks. The 270th Field Artillery Battalion brought their 240mm howitzers into action on July 24th, systematically destroying German strongpoints that had somehow survived the massive carpet bombing campaign. Hill 122 dominated Saint-Lô completely. It commanded all approaches to the town. The Germans had fortified it with concrete bunkers positioned on the reverse slopes, making them invisible to aircraft and seemingly immune to artillery attack. Technical Sergeant Raymond Jones served as Section Chief with Battery A of the 222nd Field Artillery Battalion. Years later, he recalled what he witnessed. The Germans thought they were safe in those reverse slope positions. Our forward observer radioed in the coordinates. We fired 3 rounds for effect. When the smoke cleared, all that remained was a crater in the hillside where the bunker had been. The reaction was immediate and profound. The German 3rd Parachute Division, elite troops who had endured the carnage at Monte Cassino, began abandoning prepared positions rather than face 240mm bombardment. Veterans who had never retreated from anything found themselves running from their bunkers. When their commander, General Richard Schimpf, was captured on July 31st, he told his interrogators something that reflected the complete psychological defeat. Your super-heavy artillery made static defense impossible. My men, veterans, soldiers who had never retreated, they ran from their bunkers. The assault on the Gothic Line in northern Italy during the fall of 1944 proved these howitzers could excel in mountain warfare. German engineers had spent a full year building fortifications along the Apennine ridges, using the mountainous terrain to create positions they believed no artillery could touch. The 697th Field Artillery Battalion, veterans of Anzio and the drive toward Rome, positioned their howitzers in the valleys below the Gothic Line in September 1944. Using high-angle fire, they could drop shells almost straight down onto German positions carved into the reverse slopes of mountains. The destruction of the Futa Pass fortifications showed exactly what they could accomplish. The pass controlled the main route to Bologna, and it was defended by elaborate bunker complexes built by the organization Todd. On September 16, 1944, the 697th began systematic bombardment of these positions. Private First Class Donald Matthews served as ammunition handler with the 697th. He wrote home describing what he witnessed. The shells travel so high they disappear into the clouds. Then they come straight down on the German bunkers. The explosion shakes the entire mountain. After we hit a bunker, there's nothing left but a crater. The Futa Pass fell in 5 days. German losses from bunker collapses exceeded casualties from direct combat. The 4th Parachute Division's war diary recorded the despair. American super-heavy shells penetrate overhead cover we thought was adequate. Morale is collapsing because troops refuse to occupy fortifications. The systematic destruction of the Siegfried Line, beginning in September 1944, represented the 240mm howitzer's greatest contribution to Allied victory. The West Wall stretched 390 miles from the Netherlands down to Switzerland. It contained more than 18,000 bunkers, pillboxes, and fortified positions, all built between 1936 and 1940. The 265th Field Artillery Battalion brought their M1 howitzers to the Siegfried Line near Aachen in September 1944. The fortifications they faced were formidable. Type 10 bunkers with walls 3 to 4 feet thick. Command bunkers with 8-foot walls. Infantry positions with interlocking fields of fire, creating a defensive maze. The first major test came at the Scharnhorst Line, an extension of the Siegfried Line defending Aachen. On October 8, 1944, the 265th began preparatory fire for the 1st Infantry Division's assault. In 6 hours, they fired 238 rounds. 19 of 22 targeted bunkers were destroyed. Corporal Robert Williams served as forward observer with the 16th Infantry Regiment. He witnessed the entire bombardment unfold. Each 240mm hit felt like a small earthquake. Concrete bunkers we'd been told would require days to reduce were simply gone in minutes. The Germans inside never stood a chance. The pattern repeated across the entire front. The 278th Field Artillery Battalion supporting V Corps destroyed 73 bunkers in the Schnee-Eifel region during December 1944. The 698th Field Artillery Battalion, operating near Metz, eliminated the fortress ring surrounding the city in November 1944, firing over 3,000 rounds in just 2 weeks. The Vosges Mountains campaign, running from October through November 1944, presented different challenges. German forces had fortified the heavily forested ridges with bunkers camouflaged beneath thick tree cover, invisible to aerial reconnaissance, and protected from conventional artillery by the terrain itself. The 265th Field Artillery Battalion developed new techniques adapted specifically for forest warfare. Using proximity-fused shells whenever available, they achieved air bursts above the tree canopy with blast effects that penetrated downward onto bunkers positioned below. When conventional shells were all they had, they employed a different tactic: 4 rounds at the corners of a suspected position, then 1 round directly in the center. Master Sergeant Harold Anderson served as Chief of Section with the 265th. He explained the approach. The forest made observation difficult, but the 240mm didn't require perfect precision. Even a near miss would collapse bunkers through ground shock. We'd fire, wait for the dust to settle, and the infantry would find nothing but craters and bodies. The liberation of Strasbourg on November 23, 1944, was preceded by 240mm bombardment of the outer fortifications. The German 553rd Infantry Division abandoned their positions after losing 12 bunkers in 90 minutes of targeted fire. Post-war analysis by American Army engineers finally revealed why the 240mm howitzer proved so devastatingly effective against fortifications. The concrete-piercing shell designated M-17 used a hardened steel cap, backed by the full 360 pounds of projectile mass, traveling at 2,300 feet per second. This delivered approximately 2.8 million foot-pounds of kinetic energy to an impact area smaller than 20 square inches. The resulting pressure, exceeding 200,000 psi, surpassed any concrete's compression strength. More critically, the delayed fuse allowed the shell to penetrate 3 to 6 feet before detonation. When the explosion occurred inside the concrete mass, engineers called it sympathetic fracturing. Shock waves reflected off the steel reinforcement created complex stress patterns that shattered entire structures from within. The high-explosive shell, designated M-120mm, contained 49 pounds of TNT with aluminum powder additives that increased blast effect by 40% compared to pure TNT. When fused for surface burst, it created craters 50 feet wide and 20 feet deep in average soil, 30 feet wide and 12 feet deep in rocky ground. Deploying 240mm howitzers required extraordinary logistical support that showcased American organizational capabilities. Each battalion needed 50 to 100 shells daily, 18 to 36 tons. They consumed 2,000 gallons of fuel for prime movers and generators. Specialized maintenance equipment traveled with them. Dedicated ammunition carriers with reinforced suspensions followed the guns everywhere. The ammunition supply chain stretched from Watervliet Arsenal to the front lines, sometimes covering 3,000 miles, an intricate network of transportation, storage, and distribution that kept these weapons firing. The creation of each shell demanded meticulous precision work, with tolerances measured to just 0.01 inches. Every round had to be filled with explosive compounds with painstaking care, fitted with fuses that had to work flawlessly, then subjected to rigorous inspection and proof testing. By the spring of 1945, the United States Army had accumulated a staggering stockpile of over 500,000 240mm rounds stored across European depots. When the fighting intensified, consumption skyrocketed. During the Rhine crossing operations, ammunition usage peaked at 35,000 rounds each month. This represented industrial muscle that Germany, Japan, or even the Soviet Union simply could not match. The March 1945 Rhine crossings showed the 240mm howitzer operating at absolute peak performance. General Montgomery's Operation Plunder began on March 23 to 24, with what became the largest artillery bombardment of the entire Western campaign. The American 12th Corps committed 12 of these massive 240mm howitzers to the assault. The target was the German fortified zone around Wesel, where the 84th Infantry Division had dug in with elaborate bunker networks along the eastern bank. At 5 o'clock on the evening of March 23, the bombardment commenced. The howitzers began their systematic work, deliberately destroying each identified position. Captain William Morrison, commanding Battery B of the 278th Field Artillery Battalion, kept records of the operation. "We had aerial photographs showing every bunker they'd built," he noted. Working methodically from north to south, The gun crews engaged each fortified position with between 4 to 6 rounds. By the time midnight arrived, they had destroyed 31 bunkers and severely damaged another dozen. When the infantry crossed the river, they met almost no organized resistance. German survivors who managed to escape described complete psychological collapse after witnessing their fortifications simply vanish. The 84th Division's casualty reports showed 2,400 men lost to artillery strikes alone, the vast majority killed when their bunkers caved in. The battle demonstrated the devastating power when precision firepower met concentrated defenses. As American forces pushed deeper into Germany, 240mm howitzers were employed, reducing the Ruhr pocket between April 1st to 18. They turned their attention to industrial facilities that the Germans had converted into fortresses. The 698th Field Artillery Battalion worked the northern sector, methodically destroying one position after another. German forces had taken massive factories and reinforced them with additional concrete to create defensive strongholds. On April 9th, the attention turned to the Krupp Steel Works in Essen, which had been heavily fortified with multiple layers of reinforcement. The bombardment commenced with devastating effect. Just 24 rounds transformed the main factory buildings into twisted wreckage. Staff Sergeant James Peterson, a forward observer with the 313th Infantry Regiment, watched the destruction unfold through his scope. These weren't ordinary factory buildings, he later recalled. They were industrial fortresses built with walls 3 feet thick. Those 240mm shells punched through them like paper. The psychological effect on the German defenders was absolute and total. Soldiers surrendered in enormous numbers after witnessing what had happened to the Krupp works. Army Group B, which had started this final campaign with 430,000 men, surrendered after just 18 days of combat. Military intelligence reports identified the systematic destruction of fortified positions by heavy artillery as a crucial factor, convincing defenders that continued resistance was futile. The Watervliet Arsenal's production of 240mm howitzers represented American industrial capacity at its absolute finest. Originally established in 1813, the facility had evolved into America's primary manufacturer of large-caliber guns by the Second World War. The production numbers tell the complete story. In November 1942, they produced 6 pilot models. During 1943, output reached 72 units with a monthly average of 6. In 1944, production jumped to 158 units, averaging 13 per month. From January through August 1945, they manufactured 79 units at an average of 10 monthly. Total production came to 315 completed guns. The factory workforce peaked at 9,100 employees, working 3 shifts around the clock, 7 days every week. Women made up 35% of that workforce, performing precision machining operations that had previously been considered beyond female capability. The Arsenal's monthly payroll exceeded $3 million, making it the largest employer in the Capital District. Each gun barrel demanded 65 tons of special steel, required 847 individual machining operations, needed 72 hours of precise boring work, went through heat treatment in furnaces reaching 1,500 degrees Fahrenheit, then underwent individual proof firing with overpressure charges. The quality control standards were extraordinary. Of the 315 guns manufactured, only 2 failed acceptance testing, and both failures involved minor recoil mechanism problems that were quickly fixed. Not a single M1 240mm howitzer ever experienced catastrophic failure during combat operations. American ammunition production astonished German military analysts. Watervliet Arsenal alone produced 2,000 rounds monthly by 1944. When combined with output from Picatinny Arsenal and civilian contractors, total monthly production reached 10,000 rounds by early 1945. Each individual round represented a triumph of precision mass production. The shell body was forged from 4140 chrome molybdenum steel and machined to tolerances of plus or minus 0.01 inches. The round was filled with 49 pounds of Grade A TNT, fitted with precision-machined rotating bands, individually gauged and inspected before delivery. The logistics chain delivered this ammunition with impressive efficiency. Liberty ships carried 240mm rounds stacked on deck, with each vessel transporting up to 500 rounds. The Red Ball Express truck convoys included specialized ammunition sections with reinforced vehicles designed to handle the 360-pound shells without damage. By April 1945, American forces in Europe had expended 118,429 rounds of 240mm ammunition, while maintaining theater reserves exceeding 100,000 additional rounds. This enormous expenditure, impossible for any other belligerent nation, multiplied the weapon's psychological impact on German defenders. Operating the M-120mm howitzer required exceptional teamwork and considerable physical endurance. Each 14-man crew functioned as a precisely coordinated unit with every member absolutely essential. The crew positions included a chief of section who commanded the piece, a gunner responsible for laying the weapon, an assistant gunner who operated the breech, ammunition handlers, soldiers who operated the M2 crane, powder handlers, and vehicle drivers for security. Loading the weapon required extraordinary coordination and timing. The 360-pound projectile had to be lifted by crane, guided carefully by 4 men into the breech, then rammed home using hydraulic pressure. The powder charge, consisting of up to 8 separate bags, was loaded behind the shell. The entire process took 90 seconds for a well-trained crew working in perfect synchronization. Private First Class Michael Sullivan, an ammunition handler with the 697th Field Artillery Battalion, described the brutal physical demands. After firing 10 rounds, everyone was completely exhausted, he said. The concussion from firing felt like being punched hard in the chest. We rotated positions every hour to maintain efficiency, but knowing what our shells did to German bunkers kept us pushing forward. The forward observers who directed 240mm fire held one of the war's most perilous assignments. Positioned with frontline infantry, often operating beyond friendly lines, they identified targets and adjusted fire with lethal precision. Lieutenant Robert Anderson, a forward observer with the 265th Field Artillery Battalion, survived 187 days in combat. During that time, he directed the destruction of 47 German bunkers. In a 1985 interview, he reflected on the experience. Calling in 240mm was like summoning Thor's hammer, he explained. I'd identify a bunker, radio the coordinates, and minutes later it would simply cease to exist. The power was absolutely intoxicating, but also deeply sobering. Each shell potentially killed dozens of enemy soldiers. The equipment observers carried included a BC scope with 20 times magnification, an M1 plotting board, an SCR 610 radio as a 48-pound backpack unit, map cases with aerial photographs, compass and rangefinder. The psychological burden was tremendous. Forward observers could see the human consequences of their work through their scopes. German soldiers running from bunkers, the wounded lying in the rubble, the dead. Many reported suffering from nightmares for decades after the war ended. Captured German documents and post-war interviews revealed the terror that 240mm bombardment inspired. The Wehrmacht's experience fighting the Soviets, who relied on mass artillery barrages, had not prepared them for American precision firepower. A November 1944 report from the German 7th Army, captured near Metz, stated enemy super-heavy artillery represents a new form of warfare. Individual bunkers are engaged with observed fire of extreme accuracy. Casualties from single shells exceed those from conventional barrage. The moral effect is catastrophic. Troops refuse to occupy forward bunkers. The German 19th Army, defending the Vosges region, reported that 60% of casualties came from artillery, with 240mm fire causing disproportionate losses despite the relatively limited volume. Bunkers that had protected troops for months became death traps once American observers located them. Post-war interviews with German veterans consistently emphasized the profound psychological impact. Former Colonel Heinrich Zimmermann, who commanded a regiment in the Siegfried Line, stated in 1962 that regular artillery could be endured. But those monster shells broke our spirit. When you saw a bunker disappear, you understood that nowhere was safe. Many of my men shot themselves rather than wait for the next shell to arrive. The M1 240mm howitzer was part of an Allied super-heavy artillery force that included British and Soviet weapons. But American industrial capacity made the decisive difference. Comparative production numbers tell the story. The US manufactured 315 M1 240mm howitzers. Britain produced 36 BL 7.2-inch howitzers. The Soviets built 47 280mm BR-5 mortars. Germany managed only 8 24cm K3 railway guns. American advantage came not just from greater numbers, but from superior mobility and sustained operational capability. While German and Soviet super-heavy guns required rail transport or extensive site preparation, the American M1 could be towed slowly by tracked vehicles and positioned almost anywhere with suitable ground. British observers consistently praised American super-heavy artillery capabilities. Major General Sidney Kirkman, artillery commander for the 13th Corps, wrote that the American 240mm howitzer achieved what their own heavy guns could not: the systematic rapid destruction of fortified positions. At Cassino, these weapons were largely responsible for achieving the breakthrough. As Allied forces drove into Germany proper during early 1945, the 240mm howitzer continued its destructive work. Every German city designated a fortress by Hitler faced systematic bombardment by super-heavy artillery. The siege of Aschaffenburg from March 25 to April 3, 1945, demonstrated the weapon's urban warfare capabilities. The German 36th Infantry Division had fortified the medieval city by barricading streets and converting buildings into strong points. The 265th Field Artillery Battalion positioned 4 howitzers across the main river, systematically destroying defensive positions. The precision was remarkable. Forward observers could place 240mm rounds through specific buildings without damaging adjacent structures. This selective destruction convinced many German commanders to surrender rather than watching their cities completely leveled. The capture of Nuremberg from April 16 to 20, 1945, saw 3 240mm battalions in action. The medieval fortifications, reinforced with modern concrete, crumbled under bombardment. The 698th Field Artillery Battalion destroyed 8 major bunkers in the old city walls in just 4 hours of firing on April 19. When Germany surrendered on May 8, 1945, American 240mm howitzers had made a decisive contribution to final victory. The official statistics from US Army Ordnance provide the complete picture. Total rounds fired in the European theater came to 118,429. Bunkers and fortifications engaged totaled 3,847. Confirmed destroyed numbered 3,114, representing 81%. Damaged beyond use totaled 489, or 13%. The average rounds per target destroyed came to 38. Maximum range achieved in combat reached 25,255 yards. Gun tube replacements required totaled just 23. Catastrophic failures numbered 0. The human cost inflicted by 240mm fire proves harder to quantify. German records, often incomplete, suggest between 15,000 to 20,000 casualties directly caused by 240mm bombardment, with psychological casualties possibly doubling that figure. Combat experience led to continuous improvements in how the 240mm howitzer was employed. Early operations revealed that the 8-hour emplacement time limited tactical flexibility. By 1945, experienced crews had reduced setup time to under 4 hours through improved procedures and equipment innovations. The development of mechanical fuse setters increased the rate of fire from 1 round per 3 minutes to 1 round per 2 minutes during sustained operations, dramatically increasing the weapon's combat effectiveness. Better ammunition meant gun barrels could fire far more rounds before needing replacement. Whereas earlier shells wore down the rifling after just 500 shots, improved formulations stretched that to 800 rounds, significantly extending how long each weapon could stay in action. But the real game-changer wasn't the ammunition itself. The breakthrough came from linking aerial photography directly to targeting decisions. By 1945, forward observers were receiving photographs from reconnaissance flights with every possible target marked, numbered, and placed on a coordinate grid. This transformed everything. What once took 10 minutes to plan could now be executed in under 4. Intelligence moved faster than German defenders could react. The story of the 240mm howitzer centered primarily on Europe, but these weapons did see action across the Pacific as well. 6 of them supported operations in the Philippines, where their power proved devastating against Japanese positions. In February 1945, they pounded enemy fortifications on Corregidor, the heavily defended island fortress. Their concrete-piercing shells were particularly brutal against Japanese cave systems, caving in entrances and creating shockwaves that killed soldiers deep inside the mountain tunnels where they thought they were safe. Had the war continued, American planners were ready to deploy these weapons massively. Operation Downfall, the planned invasion of the Japanese home islands, would have required 100 of these howitzers to systematically destroy Japanese defensive preparations spread across the homeland. Japan's sudden surrender made that unnecessary, but something remarkable emerged afterward. Japanese officers who were captured and interrogated admitted they had never planned defensive strategies accounting for weapons this powerful and mobile. Their entire defensive doctrine had become obsolete before it was even tested. Military analysts since then have recognized the 240mm as genuinely revolutionary. It fundamentally changed how siege warfare worked. The combination of raw firepower, the ability to move it where needed, and the precision with which it could be aimed made traditional fortifications pointless. The weapon gave ground forces exactly what they had always needed. Navy ships could pummel distant targets, bombers could level cities from the sky, but ground soldiers had lacked this kind of precision firepower. Now they had it. Any fortification, no matter how well built, could be destroyed with calculated accuracy. Soviet commanders who were shown German bunkers after the war found themselves stunned. Marshal Vasily Chuikov, the legendary defender of Stalingrad, walked through destroyed sections of the Siegfried Line and became convinced of something profound. He remarked to observers that the Americans had truly solved the problem of modern fortifications. It wasn't about using masses of weapons or hundreds of hours of bombardment. One gun, he understood, could accomplish what his own artillery would need days to accomplish. The Americans had found efficiency where traditional warfare saw only volume. Yet that efficiency came at a psychological cost. The terror of facing these weapons scarred survivors in ways that extended far beyond simple physical injuries. German veterans who lived through bombardments carried psychological wounds that lasted their entire lives. Medical researchers documented the patterns carefully. 73% of bunker survivors developed seismophobia, an intense fear of vibrations and tremors. 67% suffered from claustrophobia so severe they couldn't enter enclosed spaces. Most striking, 89% experienced phonophobia, an overwhelming fear of loud sounds that sometimes paralyzed them decades later. During the 1950s, a Munich psychiatrist named Dr. Hans Müller was treating these traumatized veterans when he recognized a distinct pattern emerging. He coined the term bunker syndrome to describe the cluster of symptoms his patients shared. Nightmares were constant. Panic attacks struck without warning. Many patients experienced complete inability to step inside concrete structures of any kind. Müller's research revealed something crucial. The sudden, total destruction of positions that soldiers had been told were safe created a unique type of psychological trauma, one that didn't respond well to standard treatment. The mind couldn't reconcile the absolute security promised by thick concrete with the absolute destruction that occurred anyway. American soldiers bore their own psychological burdens from operating these weapons. Forward observers reported suffering nightmares where they replayed calling in fire missions, sometimes waking in panic, convinced they'd made a fatal error. Gun crews spoke of permanent hearing loss that no protective equipment seemed to prevent. The physical sensation of firing remained burned into their memories for decades. The ground beneath them would heave, their chests would compress from the concussion, and the noise would be so overwhelming that time seemed to stop. They carried those sensations with them for the rest of their lives. The 240mm represented something distinctive about American military culture. Germans pursued individual masterpieces, weapons of spectacular power but built in tiny numbers. They created the Karlsgerät, a massive mortar of which only 6 were built, requiring 24 hours to set up and capable of firing 1 round every 10 minutes. They built the Schwerer Gustav, an enormous railway gun, but constructed only 2. These were engineering triumphs, but they were one of a kind. America took the opposite approach. American factories mass-produced 315 of the 240mm Howitzers. They could be set up in 4 hours and fire 1 round every 2 minutes. Thousands of them could be replaced if lost. This represented fundamentally different philosophies of war. Germany sought wonder weapons, technological breakthroughs that would provide decisive advantages. America sought weapons that could be manufactured by the thousands, weapons reliable enough to work every single time. The entire 240mm program, from development through production to ammunition manufacturing, cost approximately $120 million in 1945 currency. That same money could have purchased 40 B-24 bombers or 1,600 Sherman tanks. Yet strategically, the ability to eliminate any fortification quickly justified every dollar spent. It transformed how ground warfare could be waged. The influence of this weapon extended beyond World War II itself. After the war, the Soviet Union developed their own super-heavy mobile artillery, the 2S-4 self-propelled mortar, explicitly basing their design on what they learned from American World War II experience. The fire control techniques developed for the 240mm, especially the forward direction center system and the integration of aerial reconnaissance into targeting, became standard doctrine for all artillery worldwide. Modern precision-guided ammunition traces its conceptual roots directly back to the targeting procedures perfected in 1944 and 1945. Several of these weapons survive today as monuments to their era. At Fort Sill in Oklahoma, serial number 14 stands on display, the very gun that fired the first combat round at Anzio. The Watervliet Arsenal Museum preserves serial number 1, the original prototype that proved super-heavy mobile artillery could actually work in practice, not just on paper. The 240mm accomplished something genuinely rare in military history. It rendered an entire category of military structures obsolete. For centuries, fortifications had been the foundation of defensive warfare. Soldiers built walls, dug trenches, constructed strongpoints because physical barriers provided genuine advantage. By the 20th century, that tradition had reached its ultimate expression. Concrete bunkers and steel pillboxes represented the peak of defensive engineering. Within 18 months of combat, the 240mm ended that entire era. Fortifications that had been built at enormous expense, requiring months of labor and tons of materials, could be destroyed in minutes by a single accurate shot. General Dwight Eisenhower reflected on this in his post-war writings. The 240mm gave us something we desperately needed, he explained. We could crack defensive positions quickly and efficiently. Infantry wouldn't need to launch costly assaults across open ground against prepared positions. Thousands of American lives were saved because fortifications that would have required massive frontal assaults could simply be demolished from a distance. The German perspective proved equally revealing. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, who commanded defending forces in Italy and later in southern Germany, offered his assessment after the war. The American 240mm was simply a weapon we could not counter, he admitted. Bunkers we had built at tremendous cost became death traps. The psychological impact was absolutely devastating. Soldiers stopped believing that any defensive position could protect them. Behind all the statistics and strategic analysis stood individual soldiers whose courage and professionalism made victory possible. Sergeant David Mathis served in the 697th Field Artillery Battalion from the beaches of Anzio through the final days of the war. He participated in destroying over 100 enemy positions. Looking back on it in 1990, he reflected on what it meant to operate such a weapon. We understood we had something special, he said. When infantry units called for our fire, we could eliminate obstacles that had stopped entire divisions. But every shell we fired killed dozens of enemy soldiers. It was necessary, but it wasn't something that felt good. Lieutenant Harold Sanders commanded forward observers with the 270th Field Artillery Battalion during the breakout from Normandy. His team spent 73 consecutive days in frontline positions, calling in missions that destroyed 31 German strongpoints. The 240mm was our secret weapon, he reflected. When other approaches failed, when Germans thought they were safe in their positions, we could reach out and eliminate them. It saved American lives, and that's what mattered most to us. These soldiers and thousands like them wielded weapons of unimaginable destructive power with professional discipline and precision. They converted American industrial capacity into military victory, one devastating round at a time. German commanders adapted quickly to this threat, though no truly effective defense emerged. By late 1944, German tactical doctrine shifted dramatically. New defensive guidelines emphasized scattered positions and camouflage rather than concentrated bunkers. The 7th Army issued orders stating that fixed fortifications should be abandoned whenever American super-heavy artillery was present. Troops should build dispersed field positions, constantly relocated, with only light overhead cover suitable for conventional shells, not these devastating superweapons. Bunkers, the orders stressed, concentrated casualties rather than preventing them. This represented a complete reversal of German military tradition. For decades, dating back to the Prussian military tradition and refined through World War I and the Eastern Front, German doctrine had emphasized elaborate field fortifications. Suddenly, that entire philosophy was abandoned. Some German efforts showed limited promise. Dummy bunkers heated to appear occupied sometimes drew fire away from genuine positions. Smoke generators obscured observation. Electronic jamming attempted to disrupt American radio communications. None of these countermeasures truly worked. They merely delayed the inevitable destruction. General Hasso von Manteuffel, commanding the 5th Panzer Army during the Battle of the Bulge, captured German frustration precisely. America's industrial superiority was something they could accept, he explained. That was expected when fighting an industrial giant. But the precision of American heavy artillery made every defensive position vulnerable. They weren't simply outgunned, he said. They were outclassed in ways they couldn't overcome. Operating these weapons demanded a tremendous price from American soldiers as well. Gun crews suffered catastrophic hearing damage. Post-war studies by the Veterans Administration revealed that 90% of 240mm veterans experienced significant hearing loss. The concussion from firing caused chronic traumatic encephalopathy in some long-service crew members, permanent brain injuries from repeated shock waves. Forward observers suffered the highest casualty rates of any artillery specialty. Of 127 forward observers trained for 240mm battalions, 31 were killed and 43 wounded, a casualty rate of 58%. Their exposed positions made them vulnerable, and German commanders made eliminating them a high priority. Survival often seemed like pure luck. Mechanical failures, though uncommon, could be catastrophic. On March 3, 1945, near Prum, a 240mm howitzer experienced a premature detonation inside its barrel. The explosion killed 5 crew members instantly. Investigation determined that a faulty fuse had caused the detonation, leading to significant improvements in ammunition quality control procedures. The logistical requirements were staggering. Each 240mm battalion needed 67 vehicles in support, including specialized prime movers, heavy cranes for ammunition handling, and dedicated ammunition carriers. When moving, the battalion consumed approximately 2,000 gallons of fuel daily. The weapons themselves were so heavy that they damaged roads, requiring engineer support to maintain supply lines. The entire system demanded tremendous resources to sustain. The 240mm embodied American warfare at its most effective. Overwhelming firepower delivered with precision, backed by an industrial system that could manufacture ammunition and replacement weapons indefinitely. Individual German bunkers might have been stronger than American positions, but American industry could destroy them faster than German industry could construct them. This mathematical certainty of victory through industrial production terrified German commanders far more than any tactical defeat. They could sometimes counter superior leadership with clever tactics. They could offset numerical disadvantage through superior training, but they could not answer unlimited precision firepower backed by infinite ammunition supplies. The system itself was unbeatable. The 240mm was ultimately an expression of American industrial democracy, defeating European totalitarianism. Free workers in Detroit, Pittsburgh, and Watervliet manufactured weapons that demolished fortifications built by slave labor. The victory was moral as well as military, proof that democratic societies could mobilize greater power than dictatorships. The German experience with American 240mm howitzers transcended mere military defeat. It represented psychological transformation through technological shock. Soldiers who had believed in German engineering superiority, who had trusted in the impregnability of concrete fortifications, who had confidence in the defensive advantages of prepared positions, discovered that American industrial capacity had rendered their entire military doctrine obsolete overnight. The statistics alone convey part of the story. 315 howitzers were manufactured. 118,429 rounds were fired. 3,114 bunkers were destroyed. But the true impact lay in something less quantifiable. German faith in fixed defenses collapsed completely. Every shattered bunker demonstrated American superiority across every dimension of modern warfare: logistics, production, technology, and organizational capability. The 240mm didn't simply destroy fortifications. It demolished the psychological foundations supporting German resistance. Wehrmacht soldiers learned to fear not merely the shell itself, but everything it represented. Unlimited ammunition supplies, precise fire control systems, mechanical reliability that never failed. The terrible efficiency of American industrial democracy. In the ruins of the Siegfried Line, what lay broken was not merely concrete. The shattered remnants of Nazi Germany's military pretensions had been obliterated. The thunder of the 240mm howitzer was the sound of American industrial might announcing inevitable victory. Every German soldier who heard it understood what that sound meant. They had challenged the arsenal of democracy, and they had lost. The terror they felt would echo through the decades. Veterans would spend their remaining years attempting to process the trauma of watching supposedly impregnable fortifications disintegrate into clouds of pulverized concrete. From that terror came understanding. The age of fixed fortifications had ended. Military doctrine based on static defense had become obsolete. The 240mm howitzer had spoken with the voice of American industry, and its message was unmistakable and final. In modern industrial warfare, no defensive position can withstand destruction. No fortification can remain unbreached. No bunker is safe from becoming a tomb. The Germans faced more than terror when American 240mm howitzers obliterated their fortresses. They experienced transformation, the shocking revelation of American power that made continued resistance genuinely hopeless. The greatest victory of the 240mm lay not in the fortifications it destroyed, but in the minds it changed fundamentally. German soldiers who began the war confident in their technological superiority ended it understanding they had been overwhelmed by an industrial democracy that could convert raw materials into precision weapons. Faster than totalitarianism could construct concrete walls. The thunder of the 240mm howitzer was democracy's answer to tyranny, delivered one earth-shaking round at a time. That thunder would echo through history as proof that freedom, properly mobilized, possessed power that tyranny could never match.